one of the big issues that we faced from early on was how do we handle money? And do we ask for money or not? And what about going into debt? And all of these tough questions that were floating around, particularly in the early days of our missionary uh, ventures. So I felt the Lord was saying to me, don't go into debt. That was one principle that I felt like we needed to follow. Never go into debt. The second principle that I decided, I felt the Lord was leading us in, was that we should always get at least 30% of the money for any project we would undertake before we started it. So 30% had to be upfront, and then we trusted the Lord to provide as we went along for the rest of it. Well, that was sometimes very hard, but it proved to be over the years a wonderful blessing to us because we didn't take on projects that were just way beyond anything that we could do. And yet it gave us plenty of room for faith to believe that God could provide. We just believed that he could, if he could provide the money, he could provide 30% up front before we started. So we did a lot of things that where we had to just in faith believe that God was going to provide. I think the first big issue that I came face to face was when we went to Calcutta. We set a budget of $25,000. Now you've got to remember this is 1961, and that 25,000 is probably like 250,000 today. So the day we left, the day we got on the boat in New York, we had received $27,500. Now, Eloise and I put the first money in. We were as poor as could be. We had $11 that we opened a bank account with, and we just started sharing it with people and telling people what we were going to do, and people started giving us money. And by the time we left on the boat, 27,500, 2,000 more than we had prayed for. I remember another case that I was really concerned about. We had ordered Bible books for distribution in Brazil, and money we needed $7,000 to buy these things, and after a month or so, we only had $3,500, and I knew I had to pay the money the next day. I'd promised that I would make the payment the next day, and so we had $3,500. So I remember going to the bank, wiring the $3,500, and I wrote a note or sent a letter to the person that was in Brazil, and I said, "This is all the money I have right now, but I'm going to get you the balance." Well, the president of Brazil, that night after I had sent the money, that night he devalued the Cruzeiro, which is the Brazilian currency at the time, so that the $3,500 I shipped at 6 o'clock was worth $7,000 the next morning in Brazil when they went to the bank to get it. And God did things like that time and time again. I remember when we purchased the property in Prospect Heights. We went to the lady and we said to the lady, "Okay, we'll pay you $50,000 for the property," and she agreed, and so we started praying. We had to produce the 50,000 within 35 days. And so we started letting our friends and people we knew know, and at 30 days we had $20,000, and I was really worried because I thought I've got 5 days to get another 30, and it's taken me 30 days to get 20. How can I get 30 in 5 days? Well, a man I hardly knew, a man I hardly knew, came to our door in Park Ridge, knocked on the door one night, and handed me an envelope. And he said, maybe this will help you. And then he walked away. And he was a kind of a retiring, introverted man. He didn't want to talk. And I opened it up, the envelope, and in it was $30,000 worth of stock certificates that he gave. And it just confirmed that this was the right thing to do. It's confirmations like this that God gave us time and time again. I remember we needed 3 new vehicles to work in our for our Iron Curtain work. Interestingly, that our ministry behind the Iron Curtain, we had these specially prepared vehicles, and it usually took 3 to 6 months to build one of these. We would buy a vehicle, then strip it all down to the chassis, and then rebuild it back up with special compartments in it to smuggle the materials that we were delivering across the borders. And we usually bought a used vehicle because we didn't want to show up at the borders with a new vehicle, because that would be suspicious. So I said, we decided we needed 3 vehicles, and we'd buy them each for about $8,000. So we needed $25,000 to do this. And I was in Atlanta that weekend preaching in a church. And I was standing up the front on the front row of the church and waiting to be called up to speak. And they were singing a hymn and giving the announcements and stuff, and they were going to call me up. And while I was standing there on the front row waiting, I kept getting this message in my head: transport, transport, transport. And I said, well, what am I going to do with transport? And I kept going. So when I got up to speak, I started telling them that we needed 3 vehicles that would cost $25,000 to transport materials behind the Iron Curtain. And I used transport 3 or 4 times as I told them the story about the need. And a man came up to me at the end of the day, a sermon, and said to me, he said, I own a transport company. I'll pay for the $25,000. And he gave me a check right on the spot for $25,000. Only God can do those kind of things, because it just happens. I also remember that when we built a building, a large building on our property in Prospect Heights, we called it the Little Building, but it was a big building, and it was going to cost us $1,800,000. And our principle was you don't start till you get 30%. So we needed $600,000 before we could even start digging a hole. And so I was really concerned, how do we get 600,000? And I went to a foundation, and they asked me to make a presentation. I got to this foundation, and I felt very oppressed or something. I just felt like this is not going well, and for some reason, I've never done this before, never done it since. I just burst into tears in front of all these men at this foundation. They were all gathered around, and for some reason I just burst into tears, and the tears were streaming down my face as I was telling them about this building and what I needed. And so I left thinking, boy, this is a total disaster. This is a failure if ever I've had a failure. Well, they called me up in about a couple of days and said, we're going to give you a gift of $750,000. So we had our 600,000 to start, and so we began. And by the time we finished the building, it was all paid for, no debt, no debt, and that's the principle that we operated on, no debt. And it was very tough sometimes, very hard, but God did these things time and time again.